Hello, everybody, and welcome to the OWI Institute webinar series. I'm Katie Stevens, the Director of Education at OWI. Our webinar series is designed to bring you the latest research and analysis about identity, trust, and safety, presented by OWI's research team and leading industry experts. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. First, throughout the webinar, poll questions related to the content will appear on your screen. These are intended to help us learn about our audience as well as to track continuing education participation. My apologies for the dog barking in the background. Please take a few seconds to answer each poll and we'll post the results on the screen. If you've logged into the webinar with the email that you registered with and you participate in those polls, we will email you a certificate of participation later this week that you can submit to your professional associations for continuing education credit. If at any point in the presentation you have a technical issue, please use the on-screen chat feature to chat with panelists so we can attempt to help you. If you have a content question during the presentation, there's a Q&A feature within the interface that you can use to send questions to the team. And we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. All right, let's get started. Today, I am here with Maxine Most, founding principal of Acuity Market Intelligence, who is recognized as the definitive authority on global biometrics market development. Throughout her 30-year career, Maxine has evangelized emerging technology on 5 continents. Since 2001, she has focused on biometric and digital identity markets, where she has earned a stellar reputation for innovative thought leadership and a proven ability to accurately anticipate biometric and digital identity market trends. She is the author of numerous Acuity research reports and regularly offers insight and analysis in on and offline publications, is quoted often in the press, and presents regularly at industry events on the evolution and development of biometrics and digital identity markets. She graduated from UC San Diego with a multidisciplinary degree in mathematics and computer science and minors in visual arts and economics. We know that biometrics can be a great way to improve convenience and reduce fraud, but there are questions about their efficacy and social impact, as well as tricky legal and policy concerns. So today we'll discuss how biometric technologies can enhance and create challenges in trust and safety across 5 key pillars: user assurance, fraud management, security, data stewardship, and regulatory compliance. We'll start with a quick poll. Take a moment to share with us your level of expertise around biometrics. Okay, you should be able to see those results on your screen. It looks like we have a fairly knowledgeable audience with us today, which is great. I'd like to open our discussion by talking about biometrics in the context of user assurance. So, Maxine, at OWI, we define user assurance, or talk about user assurance, as addressing the user experience and how their experiences inform their impressions of trust and safety. In other words, how does an enterprise encourage user engagement and how do they ensure continued participation? So my first question to you would be, from a user perspective, what are some common misconceptions about biometric security that impact their diffusion through the marketplace?
That's a great question and a great start. And I'd like to thank you, Katie, and thank everyone for who's joining us today on the webinar. I think one of the most important misconceptions about biometrics is that biometrics can be, quote, stolen or you can lose them. And the reality is that when we're talking about biometrics, we're not talking about image data. We're not talking about a picture. We're not talking about the actual fingerprint image data or excuse me, or a photograph of your face. What we're doing is we're taking that data, that image data, and we are applying an algorithm to it, and we're transforming it into a mathematical representation that if handled appropriately, is also then encrypted. So the idea that what we store as a biometric is actually who you are in a sort of general conceptual way is just quite wrong. It's a algorithmic representation that uses your appearance, an image of your eye, an image of your finger, so on and so forth, the sound of your voice, even your behavioral patterns, and transforms that into something that can be used within the context of providing an authentication mechanism.
Okay. So given that there is this misconception around that kind of thing, what are you seeing with regard to how companies communicate about biometric use? And how does that communication impact user perception, user assurance, and the kind of point that you're talking about now?
Well, I think what's interesting, obviously, is since Apple introduced a fingerprint sensor onto an iPhone in 2013, the overall user or consumer perception of biometrics has radically changed. In fact, in a recent survey, they were asking people about biometrics. Excuse me. And there was some people were saying, oh, well, I don't really like biometrics. But if you ask them if they like the fingerprint sensor on their phone, they'd say, oh, yes. So, part of this is because it's now embedded in, according to Acuity calculations, by the end of this year, on the order of 2 billion mobile devices, vast majority of which are smartphones, people don't even think that they're using biometrics. They don't even know what it is. They're like, oh, this really cool thing on my phone. I can just put my finger here and it works. So I think part of this is actually a positive thing, because for biometrics to be truly successful, they have to kind of be ubiquitous, and we have to not think about them any more than we think about what kind of hard drive we have on our computer. Most of us probably don't even know we have a hard drive on our computer. So to me, this evolution is really critical. And so I think that it's incumbent upon organizations that want to advance the use of biometrics. And I have been in this industry for 17 years, and I'm an advocate of biometrics because I think they offer a lot of unique advantages over other methods of authentication. I think it is important that we do communicate to people what biometrics are, that they do understand it, and that critically what they understand is that these aren't things that you can lose, or that they're not things that can be stolen. So I think that's part of the education piece that I'd like to see. I was at Money 2020, which is a big fintech conference. I'm sure people know about it. And the biometrics panel, there were like 3 or 4 times I heard people say biometrics aren't a secret. And I'm like, thank God, because that's a message I think we need to be communicating really clearly to users. So that increases their comfort with the technology if we can explain to them that it's not a secret, it's not something you can lose, it's not something that can really be stolen. And that furthermore, if you actually have a database of biometrics, and if for some reason someone did access that data, it's not clear to me you can do anything with that data because it's just a bunch of numbers, particularly if it's stored as it should be, which is not stored anywhere near any other personally identifiable information. But in fact, if a database is hacked, you can just delete it and regenerate new templates from a new algorithm. So in many respects, it's much safer than other methods, and it's much less invasive in terms of personal information. I think that's something that we really have to communicate. And the way that biometrics operate and the advantages they can offer.
I think the general perception is that the exact opposite of that is true. That
Yes.
Things like fingerprints and iris scans are incredibly invasive, and what your position is that's not true, and we need to find better ways to communicate that. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that actually, if my biometric template of mine is stored in a database, in a secure database, in a database that isn't linked to any other personally identifiable information, and it's in a database that is purposely built to be secure, I'm much happier with that than every single retail organization, financial service organization, and everybody else I'm doing business with having all of my PII in files sitting inside of databases that were not purpose-built to be secure.
Gotcha. We have a question. You referenced a survey a few minutes ago, and one of our viewers has asked, the biometric survey you mentioned, is that a US only survey?
I believe, excuse me, I believe it was, I'm trying to think, I believe it was something that came out of the UK. I'll have to check because honestly, I look at so many of these constantly. And, what caught my eye so much was when they asked that question, I said, they're not, they have to be clear about what they're communicating with people about biometrics. So I'll see if I can reference it and send it to you. Maybe we can send that out to the people that are on the webinar today. I keep these things stored in my Evernote file and I have to go back and find them.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question that relates to user assurance. It's a slightly different approach. Do organizations that are using biometric systems for whatever purpose, do they generally provide some sort of opt-in, opt-out choice? And if so, what is the cost of the opt-in versus opt-out to consumers or to the organizations?
Well, generally, where we're seeing this, okay, let's take a step back. When we're talking about consumer applications, today it's totally opt-in. I don't know of any consumer application where anybody's actually being forced to submit their biometrics. I think, at least in the United States, I know in other countries there are certainly banks that are requiring fingerprints to open accounts. We haven't seen that as any, in the United States. I don't think we will. Certainly in the enterprise environment, there are corporations that are mandating the use of biometrics, and that's, part of what happens when you work for a company. I don't know if, most of those organizations give their employees an option. They're using, for example, biometrics are being used for bank tellers who log into their computers so the bank can actually have a reliable audit trail of what those employees are doing on a work-based computer during work. And I don't really think there's a lot of pushback that you can apply to that situation. Consumers to date, it's totally consumer choice. And what we're finding is that consumers really like it because to date, the vast majority of biometric applications have been designed for consumer use, have been designed for convenience.
Right.
And if it's more convenient, people are really happy with it.
Yeah. All right, well, let's switch our focus a little bit now to talk about our second pillar of trust and safety, which is fraud management. So from the OWI perspective, fraud management addresses how to prevent and detect deceitful user behavior and how to exclude participation that does not meet quality standards. So before I dive into my questions related to that, I am going to open up our second poll. If I can find that on my screen.
I'm a little disappointed, Katie, that I don't get to participate in the poll.
Sorry about that. So taking a look at how many organizations that folks that are with us today are using biometric technologies for fraud detection in particular.
Well, what's interesting about this subject too is I'm guessing that there are folks that work in organizations where the technology is being used and they may not know about it.
Right, right.
And I have some feelings about that. I actually don't think that's an appropriate use of the tech, but it is being done behind the scenes in certain cases, particularly behavioral biometrics are being applied both in consumer and enterprise use.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I've heard tell, particularly in Europe, where people say, "Oh, we can get away with it under the cookies exception." I personally don't find that convincing.
Well, I may have some follow-up questions about that if we have time, but it looks right now like most of the folks who are here are under the impression that their organization is not currently using this technology. I would love to be able to figure out whether or not that is correct or your point might be more, but I guess we can't really do that. So,
well, yeah, I know in particular there are banks that are and e-commerce companies that are using this in the background for internal and external transactions.
Interesting. Okay, so in the context of fraud management and identity in particular, we think about identity at OWI in terms of 5 building blocks. So that's creation, verification, authentication, authorization, and federation. Of those 5, which do you think that biometrics are most likely to impact, and how will that impact drive fraud detection and prevention?
Well, really, I think that biometrics have a role to play across the board. And my perspective on this, and I think this is something that's beginning to evolve in the industry a little bit, that to create any kind of identity-based system, you have to have biometrics really operating at the core. In order to, and in many countries, that's not really an issue because they have national ID systems that incorporate biometrics. So their core verifiable identity is based on an existing government-issued ID number that is linked to biometrics.
So the biometrics become part of the identity creation process.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I think, you can say, okay, we're going to create an identity, and then you're going to say we're going to link that identity to a biometric at the time of creation. Mm-hmm. What's one way to do it? You can actually have an identity, and you can talk about an offline identity or a digital identity, and there's a lot of complexity to that because you can have what I call a unique verifiable digital identity, which is linked to a true identity. You can have multiple identities, digital identities online that are linked to a single offline identity. So there's a lot of complexity in it. But I think it makes sense from my perspective to link, when you're creating a digital identity, to link the biometric to that identity at the time so that you can verify the person, you can authorize transactions, you go through that whole process. So I really believe ultimately that's where we're going to see this going. One of the problems you have is if you're trying to link a biometric to an identity after the fact, there's opportunity for fraud and abuse in that process.
Okay, so something in that time gap allows for, can you give an example of the kind of fraud that might occur if it's not done at the initial creation?
Well, we saw this initially when Apple Pay came out, right? People were linking their own biometrics to credit cards that didn't belong to them. So there was a gap between in that case, the issuance of a credential that was linked to some identity and someone enrolling in a biometric system. So there are ways to work around this. There are multiple sort of approaches you can take to minimize the risk associated with linking a biometric to an identity. But I think to create a system where we have unique verifiable identity, it does make a lot of sense when that digital identity is originating, that you're linking the biometric to it, at the time, and then using biometrics. And the other thing too, I think is important. I like to use this example. I went to the UK in November, and it was my first totally non-cash trip overseas. And one of the things that I loved was I was able to use my iPhone to pay for my tube tickets as I was getting on and off the tube. And because I was using that, I got the maximum discount and whatever else. It really simplified my life. Now, I was using Apple Pay and I was using my finger. It was a convenience thing at that point. But, I think you have to look at transactions like, okay, I'm buying something from a vending machine or I'm getting on or off the tube versus I'm transferring $10,000 from my bank account. Now, there may be a lot of use cases where it may be overkill to try to do biometric authentication, and if the biometric authentication is limited to doing on device, what it really is in that case is a convenience factor for the user that sits on top of a PIN or a password. So the biometrics itself is sitting on the device and it's not being used to authenticate the user beyond the device. So that's one case where it's very convenient. But if I'm for example, I said if I'm transferring $10,000 out of my bank account, I want a higher level of authentication for that kind of transaction. So I think you really have to look at it based on the use case, based on the risk and the value of the transaction. If I'm accessing my healthcare records, I'd kind of like pretty high level of authentication on that. If I'm, if I'm looking at my, my bank account, I want a high level of authentication on that. If I'm looking up maybe what I bought last time from Macy's when I ordered online, maybe I'm not as worried about that. So I think we have to think about it in the context of building models that address the risk and the value of the transactions that we're looking at.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you thought that there were financial institutions in particular that might be using behavioral biometrics kind of behind the scenes, unbeknownst to consumers. Can you talk a little bit more about how behavioral biometrics might be used in that context?
So one of the things that I actually think behavioral biometrics are fantastic because what they do, particularly in the context, they've been around for a long time. It used to be keyboard typing when people talked about behavioral biometrics or mouse movements. Now we're talking about the way you actually interact with your mobile device, the way you hold your phone, the way you swipe, the way you type, the angle, all that stuff. So they're using a lot of the built-in sensors that are on mobile phones to create a profile of how you interact with that device. Now, from my perspective, I think it's a great idea. I think if you do that in the background while you're interacting with the device and you get a high level assurance that this is the person that it's supposed to be, that's great. And what's also really good about behavioral biometrics is if you get information from the behavioral biometrics that raises a flag, you can add another biometrics, what we call do a step up. You can say, okay, in order to engage in this transaction, I need to capture an image of your face, or we need to do a fingerprint image or something like that. So they can be used in concert with other biometrics in a way that allows you to sort of do a background authentication and then step up when needed. The other place where this is being used is for identifying fraud. So not just in terms of the actual interaction with the device, but also the kind of transactions that you're doing, the pattern of your actual behavior in terms of how often you may access a certain account, or how much money you may move around. So the behavioral biometrics are being incorporated with other sort of behavioral mechanisms to actually detect potential fraudulent behavior before it happens. And again, in that case, you can introduce other authentication mechanisms, other kinds of biometrics to identify whether or not you've got a fraudulent situation on your hands. So I actually think it's terrific. I just think that people should know that this is going on in the background, and they should give their consent to an organization capturing that kind of information for them. And again, this kind of information, if it's stored on a database, it's encrypted, it's algorithmic. If you hack into a database and get that data, there's nothing you can really do with it anyway. So it's not something that exposes you, but it actually really can protect you.
Okay. I want to acknowledge at this point that we're getting a fair number of questions from the audience. They're not specific to what we're talking about right now, so I'm going to hold a few of them to the end, and we'll definitely leave time. I do want to move on to the concept of security and put up our last poll question for the day, which is around that. And I think this next section we're going to hit again on a couple of things you've already started addressing, so that'll be good. All right, so this is just an opinion poll about how folks feel about biometrics as they relate to security. This is interesting, or probably not all that surprising, but we're getting a pretty consistent result here. We'll share that now. Everyone thinks that they're useful. So you're preaching to the choir here today.
All right, well, that's okay.
So, you were talking earlier about the fact that you're really comfortable with biometrics and that systems that are holding them are designed specifically to keep them safe. So what changes are required in security measures for companies that are using these? And is biometric data proving to be more difficult to secure than other data?
I think we know how to secure data. The question is whether or not we do it. And that's two different conversations. And my shtick on this is that, and this also relates a lot to this sort of the blockchain hysteria that's going on across the world.
Mm-hmm.
We are, and I think really the reason why why blockchain is so interesting to people is because it offers a purpose-built approach to securing data. And I think the problem that we're having right now with so many data breaches, I mean, this is just one of the problems, is, as I mentioned, people aren't using necessarily best practices to secure the data to begin with. But the fundamental problem is we are using database technology that was purpose-built to be mined, right? To
Mm-hmm.
store our information. And we're asking ourselves, gee, why can't we secure it? And so I think we're at a point now where we have to start saying, okay, we have to purpose-build databases to secure data, right? We can't just take these relational databases that were built because it was easier to mine data and then say, okay, we're going to use these to secure data, because those are two different problems you're trying to solve.
Sure.
Right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that, again, biometric data isn't any more or less difficult to secure than other data. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are keeping a database of biometric templates, as I said, they are algorithmically derived, they should be encrypted, and if it's done again properly with best practices, it shouldn't be stored with any other PII. So if I break into a database of biometric templates, what do I have? Well, unless I can track that back to individual people, and I know the algorithm that was used to generate it, and I can do the decryption, I can't do a lot with that data. And so the question is, how much trouble do you go to try to put all those pieces together? In itself, the fact that you're creating a more complex model builds barriers in to the system. And again, if there's a breach, you can basically, say, okay, well, now my social security number has been breached, or my address, my phone number, all this information, my birth date. Once that's out there, it's gone.
Right.
If a database, excuse me, of biometrics is breached, you can throw away the templates. So if somebody has that template and they try to use it, not only will it not work, but you have a flag, and that that is stolen data. And the other thing that's important to think about when you're thinking about biometrics is this is probabilistic data. So if you ever get an exact match between a template that you have stored and a template that's somehow being submitted, you also know that is incorrect. It's a fraud. So,
really? So
yeah.
Increased precision is a signal of fraud in that case.
Well, if it's an exact match. Gotcha.
Okay.
Right? Because it's all probabilistic, and human beings you're never going to get you're never going to get duplicate readings off of any human being, no matter what you're measuring at the same time. So so people think that's a weakness of biometrics, and I would argue it's a strength. The problem is we have security that's been defined by cryptographers, and it's all about keeping secrets, and it's all about having an exact match. And biometrics is a probabilistic system that isn't based on secrets. The integrity of a biometric system is not based on the data being secret. It's based on being able to reliably capture a live sample, a proven live sample from a human being, storing that in a template that has been encrypted and is properly stored, and then being able to get a subsequent live sample and compare it to the initial sample that you've captured, right? And it's also about applying best practices to storing the data and consistently applying liveness and anti-spoofing measures. So it's not based on it being a secret and it being an exact match. The integrity of a biometric system is based on something else. And I think that's part of the problem, is that you have a security mindset that has been built on secrets and exact matches. And now we're saying, well, we're not applying that model anymore.
We are getting a couple of audience questions that are specific to what you're talking about right now. So there's 3 in particular. So I'm going to read them all to you and then let you choose what order you want to answer them in.
We may have to come back, because sometimes my auditory recall is not fantastic.
Okay. So one is, how do you know a stolen bio template from a legit one? And that is related to another question, which is, can you elaborate on what a template is specifically? So let's start with those 2.
So a template, essentially, the way you create a biometric template is you take you capture image data. It can be an image of your face, it can be an image of your finger, it can be your earlobe, it can be any image data that you're capturing. Okay, a digital image of your iris. And you take that data and you run it through an algorithm that transforms it into what we think of as a biometric template. So without the algorithm, you don't have a biometric template. And then So it's not and there are cases where people are doing biometrics, particularly on cheap Chinese smartphones, where they're just capturing bitmaps, which is actual image data.
Mm-hmm.
That is not, from my perspective, a biometric. That's just doing image data matching. With the
Okay.
biometric, you take that algorithm and then you end up with a series of numbers, which is a code, which is representative of that image data, but it's been transformed. And then, as I said, appropriately, it should be encrypted as well.
Okay. So the last question around it is, if a hacker steals the computer readable biotemplate, which was generated from a person's raw biometrics, then can't hackers just impersonate me anywhere there is software which recognizes my computer readable biotemplate?
Okay, so there's a lot of terminology in there that doesn't really make sense. There's no such thing as a biotemplate. There's a biometric template.
Okay.
And when you're talking about, my argument is that an image, a digital image of your face, is not a biometric. It's a digital image of your face. In order to adequately use the biometric, you have to, again, apply a template to that data. And as I said earlier, it's probabilistic. So you're never going to get the same exact template data from an image of your face, because it's always going to be slightly different. You're applying the algorithm. And so what biometrics is doing is looking at the threshold of how close it is to the template. And there's a whole series of different mechanisms, depending on which type of biometric you're using, to do that threshold assessment. If you submit a, quote, stolen biometric template, let's say I managed to steal a template from a database, and I managed to link that to a human being, and I managed to get a hold of a device that is authorized to be used for that human being, and I somehow managed to push the template through that through an interaction transaction for that person, for that device. If I have stolen a template, when the match is done, it's going to come up as 100% threshold match. And that is always a stolen template. No two templates will ever be identical unless it was a stolen template. So there's so many layers of complexity in trying to make this work. It's not as simple as, okay, I got a password. All I got to do is do some kind of, attack and put the password, apply the password to the transaction, and I'll get through. It's far more complex than that.
Okay. Before we move off of the focus on security, of one last question for you, which would be, what do you think is the next frontier for biometrics from a security perspective?
Well, I really think it is this whole notion of, biometrics at the core, which means that we're going to have centralized biometric authentication. Today, most people think about biometrics. They think about it on their mobile device. It's an on-device only, transaction. Mm-hmm. Or authentication, which means that the biometric template, that data is stored on the device. And so all I'm doing is authenticating myself to a device. And then I'm using device authentication to do everything else. Now, we have cases where that's not true. If you're using behavioral biometrics, that's being done centralized. A lot of the biometric systems that people use every day for national IDs or for passports, for example, are based on centralized data. So I think what's happened over the last couple of years is there's been this on-device mentality. People have really focused on that. And the reality is that what we think of as biometric security on the device is not really security, it's convenience, because it's just sitting on top of a PIN or a password. So I think what we're going to be looking at is the sort of convergence of two things. One is more hardened biometrics on the device, so that we're not only using biometrics on a device as an overlay for a PIN or a password, but essentially that is the core security on our device. And we're going to pick up our mobile phones and it's going to recognize us. And if it doesn't, we're not getting access to them. And then we're going to combine that with a risk-based solutions that will do local biometric authentication as appropriate, and then we'll do centralized biometric authentication as appropriate. For example, as I said before, if I want to transfer $10,000, I want to wire transfer $10,000 from my bank. I don't think an on-device authentication is enough, because At the end of the day, then you're saying, yes, I've authenticated myself to my device, and then my device is going and authorizing that transaction. And to me, that's not good enough. So then in that case, I'd want to submit a biometric where the template was generated on the device and sent to a centralized server for verification.
Oh, okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting. Our next pillar is data stewardship. And so in this particular context, I want to think about that as, data stewards guide an organization in implementing best practices to ensure identity data quality, its fitness for collection and use, and the value of that data. So you've talked about the inherently probabilistic nature of biometric applications. Does that pose any kind of threat to data accuracy or integrity? And then kind of a follow-up related to the probability is, obviously, since we're not looking for exact matches, there's some, what's the word I'm looking for, variance that's allowed in these. How are those kinds of things measured and determined? Is it a risk?
That's a great question, because the thresholds are set based on the risk of and value of the transaction you're accessing, protecting, whatever else, right?
Sure.
So this is really important, this threshold data, and it has to be managed, and some of the risk mitigated can be mitigated by using multiple biometrics. I gave the example before of using behavioral biometrics in the background and then adding a step-up capability. So maybe I'm doing behavioral background, everything looks good, it's all within my normal thresholds, but now I'm going to go do something that's a higher risk, or maybe I popped out of the threshold, so I'm going to ask for a proactive biometric authentication. So applying multimodal biometrics as well as multiple authentication methods, whether it's geolocation or transaction patterns or any of those other things. You combine those to create a risk score. So all this data gets basically fed into a risk engine, and that's really how you look at it. Now, in terms of, data accuracy and integrity, again, there's certain, for certain types of data, you want to have a high level of data accuracy in terms of the data that you're storing that's non-biometric data, right? But when you're talking about biometric data, again, it's a different model of providing reliable authentication. And so I think we have to start thinking differently about the model. It's not about an exact match anymore. It's not about keeping secrets. It's about reliably capturing a live sample. One of the places where you really want to apply effort and energy to secure the biometric system is in that liveness detection, right? Because you see a lot of these spoofing attempts are made where you're basically, taking a picture of someone and sticking a contact lens on a face or whatever. There's all these different methods of trying to spoof these systems. So integrating dimensional liveness testing is critical for the integrity of a biometric system.
Okay. Well, I don't think that any conversation about biometrics would be complete without addressing, of course, regulation and compliance, given that, this, as you were talking earlier in the kind of user experience discussion, people think that they're scared by these, even though we use them on a daily basis. So how do you think biometrics are likely to change the face of regulation? And do you see major changes in regulation, policy, or law as biometrics increase in use? What's your perspective on it?
Well, obviously, you're seeing a lot. The EU tends to take a leadership position in data protection and privacy. And so we're seeing, excuse me, GDRP, PDS2, data detection, yes. The acronyms go through my mind. Anyway, we're seeing places where we're talking about multi-factor authentication, we're talking about data protection, we're talking about the ability to know what data is being stored and to delete it if you want. All those things I think are really important. And I would say that I think we're going to see more of that. I think, in the US, we don't have those kind of laws on the books. We are seeing some states on a state-by-state basis begin to put some constraints on biometric data capture, storage, and management. We're also, I think, looking at accountability for organizations that hold our data. And so what I think is that this conversation about increasing the security of data, giving users and consumers more control over their data actually really is good for the biometrics industry, because I think biometrics can be used to create solutions that allow us to more anonymously identify ourselves, to use biometrics as a lock and a key for data access. And so whereas a lot of the concern about biometrics props up and says, oh, this is more PII, and it's very special kind of PII, personally identifiable information, and we have to limit it and restrict its use. I actually think that's a benefit, because I think that we need the structure around the way we capture, manage, and use the data, that's going to actually help us create an ecosystem where we are appropriately using biometrics to its best use, and where it can really enhance privacy and data protection, as opposed to sort of Wild West where everyone's just doing whatever they want. Because I don't advocate that. I see biometrics as the solution to the problem that all of my PII is being held by dozens of organizations.
Okay, well, that kind of lends itself towards my next question, which is kind of the flip side of the original one, which is, are there compliance issues right now that biometrics can help simplify? Like, for instance, are there aspects of KYC requirements that are easier to address or measure using biometric technologies than they might be with more traditional verification or authentication technologies?
Well, absolutely. I mean, my personal vision is we're going to see independent biometric identity service providers, BISPs, or biometric as a service providers, where that data is going to be held by a single organization that does nothing else but hold that data and protect it. So if I'm a bank and I need to do a KYC on my customer and I can use a third party, first of all, I don't have to capture and store the biometric data myself, which reduces my liability. Second of all, if I have an authorized third party, then that's reducing my exposure, because that third party is taking responsibility for authenticating that individual, and it just means I can hold less of my customers' personal data. So I actually think, as that model, and these models are starting to evolve right now. I mean, I really see that kind of a service provider model taking over a lot of the risk assessments that are being done by individual industries internally by each organization, and that to me adds a lot of value. Great.
Well, I think we have a few more minutes left, and I'd love to address some of these questions that have rolled in from the listeners. So I'm just going to take them in the order they came in. And the first one is, are there examples of privacy-preserving biometric products that it asks if OWI is aware of, but I'm going to let you take that question. Privacy-preserving biometric products.
I guess, I'm trying to think in particular. Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot. You can argue that your smartphone is a biometrically enabled privacy enhancing product, right? Because what's happening now is you're using your biometrics on your smartphone to give you access to a lot of different applications. Now, I think it's limited because it's currently overlaid on top of other, on pins and passwords. But essentially, the argument behind the on-device biometrics is that I can get access to things, I can authenticate myself, and my biometrics don't have to leave my device in that regard. Mm-hmm. I think in order to really see it on a large scale, we're going to have to separate the biometric data capture, management, and storage from the other larger applications. And the financial services industry, interestingly, they're mostly interested in pushing this stuff to the edge. That's one of the reasons they like biometrics on the device, because they don't want to hold that data.
Right.
So, you see this. There's a lot of there's biometric USB fobs. There's all kinds of smaller kind of products out there where you're using biometrics to control access to the data, hard drives, and that sort of thing. And I think that's where we are today. And I just think that that's going to happen on a much broader scale over the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay. Next question, completely different approach here. It says, I'd like to ask about verifying biometrics between countries and ID systems. For example, validating the ID presented by a migrant with their home country system. Do you see examples of governments being able to validate biometrics without exchanging the actual information?
Well, this is really interesting because this is one of the key issues that came up with trying to create cross-border, even e-gate solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And to date, with the evolution of biometrics on e-passports, there was an attempt to sort of create cross-jurisdictional sharing of the data, securing the data. It hasn't, it really has not been done, and it's more for politics than anything else. There should be ways to do it. The problem is the organizations that are engaged in that process have to trust each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm saying, okay, I have data from country X, and I have somebody showing up at my border from country X, and I want country X to verify their biometrics without me getting access to what's stored on the centralized server. But, country X doesn't want to share that data with me, and I have to trust that country. If I send them, if they're being sent the biometric template, that when they do the match, that I'm going to trust that they've done it reliably and that they're giving me the data. They're giving me an appropriate response. So it's technically it's not a problem, but you run into jurisdictional and trust issues.
Yeah, this touches a lot on the webinar we had last week, which focused on trust frameworks, and we had a woman from who's working on the Aruba Happy Flow project, which is biometric authentication throughout the entire kind of curb to plane system in the Aruba airport.
Single biometric token to
right.
move to the
Precisely. And they're trying to expand those notions to other countries outside of Aruba, and are hitting, the kind of challenges that you're talking about, in that they need this framework in which these public and private organizations all trust one another to share the data in a way that makes that possible.
Right. And to date, this kind of data is existing in the government sphere. Now, there's an argument to be made that if you have independent biometric service providers, biometric, identity service providers that could manage that as a third party, and you could create a trusted network of those organizations that you could offload that outside of the specific, government sphere or private sphere, and have that happen. But it's not a technical problem per se. It's really a jurisdictional and trust problem.
Right. All right, another question. How can you address what I think is the major concern among consumers? I think it deals with privacy and permanence. The notion that once you are identified within the system, you can then be tracked in a way that traditional ID systems didn't provide.
Well, it is an important question. And I think part of it has to be that these systems have to be purpose-built to prevent that sort of thing. You have to operate within a regulatory framework that provides security, and that the systems in a way can be built to prevent misuse. Now, for example, I love this example. There is a company called Princeton Identity that does iris recognition, and part of their business is access control, and they put these readers on the wall, and they capture people's irises as they enter a facility, and some of the matching is done locally, some of it's done in a centralized manner. But what's interesting about those devices, if people say, well, I could just take it off the wall and I could just get people's biometric data, only the box is designed so that if you rip it off the wall, it destroys all the data. So I think there's always this question, and it's a big brother question. And again, I think I would, personally feel like I'd be much more comfortable with an independent third party that all they have is my biometric data and nothing else. And then limiting the amount of the rest of my PII that is scattered all over the world. Because I would argue right now, your credit card companies, your mobile phone companies, all these other organizations have so much data and information about you that you're being tracked all the time. So it's kind of the Gattaca concern, like we're all going to have our DNA tracked and we're not going to be able to do anything without it. And I guess my response to that is that any technology can be used for good or bad, and that we have to create within the structure of the technology solutions themselves, we have to prevent that from happening. And we have to, apply best practices to make sure that it can't be used for that sort of information.
Thank you for that. Last two questions that we've got so far. And if anyone else from the audience wants to ask anything else, now's the time. But the last two relate back to the idea of the biometric templates. And I'm glad that these are being asked, because that's not terminology I was particularly familiar with, and I feel much smarter now. But does the software that generates the biometric from the raw image then forget the raw image after it uses it?
Okay, so that's not necessarily a function of software as much as it is a function of solution. So It depends, right? For some applications, like for example, I have a global entry membership, which means when I come into the United States, I can use those kiosks. I don't have to wait in line in customs, or at passport control. Now, when I applied for that, they took my fingerprint data, and they hold that data because I think on a regular basis they do checks against the FBI database, because the card's good. I think the program's good for 10 years, so I think they do intermediary checks to make sure I haven't committed any felonies. So in that system, that's the way that system works. It really depends. And for consumer systems, certainly the image data should not be stored at all. The image, I can't think of a good consumer application where you'd store it. So it really depends on the particular problem that's trying to be solved.
Okay. And last question we have is, you said that there's not much risk in the biometric templates being centrally stored or stolen. So why don't banks want to hold them?
Well, that's a good question. I think they see it. It's part of it is, honestly, the financial services industry does not fully understand biometrics. And it's not the business they're in. And there have been concerted efforts by certain members of the community to push this on-device only message, and to say, oh no, you never store biometrics centralized, it's bad, you should never do that, it's dangerous. So there's been, for the past several years, there's been a lot of messaging out there that has been targeted at the financial services industry to say precisely that. So I think that's part of the reason why. I think it's also a liability issue for them. I'm sure they don't want the data. And I think that if you can build, like I said, solutions where they have the benefit of that kind of centralized system, but they don't have the liability, that's sort of like a win-win for everybody.
Okay. Well, we are about out of time, so I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day, Maxine, to do this with us today, and to thank all of the participants that we've had online. This was a really engaged group asking lots of questions, which I love. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share before we wrap up?
I just want to say, those of you who aren't familiar with Acuity Market Intelligence, which is my company, please feel free to visit the website. We have a lot of data and a lot of information that's freely available. Also, if you have specific questions about the industry, feel free to reach out to me. I'm relatively easy to find. All you have to do is Google. You can Google Acuity Market Intelligence, or Google Biometrics Market, and you'll find me, or just Google Maxine Most Biometrics. I'm happy to engage in conversation and answer questions. And as I said earlier, I'm an advocate of this technology. But I'm an advocate of it being used appropriately and as a privacy enhancing technology, not as a privacy invasive one.
Excellent. And we can, when we send out our email follow up to all of the participants, we can share with them the link to your organization as well.
Great, that would be terrific. Yeah.
Okay. So last thing to say is we invite everyone here to join us in Washington, D.C., March 26th through 28th for the No Identity Conference, where we will be tackling many topics just like this one. You can register for that online now. And with that, I will say thank you to everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.